I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Ukraine's bombardments against Russian energy facilities finally spark gas shortages in Moscow, we assess the gaping hole in Europe's drone defences amid yet more violations. Then we leave you with one more documentary from David Knowles, who visits the site of one of the worst Nazi war crimes to take place in Ukraine during the Second World War.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 26th of September, 3 years and 216 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's Associate Editor for Defence, Dominic Nicholls, our Berlin correspondent, James Rothwell, and the creator of this podcast, David Knowles. But first, over to Dom for the latest military developments.
Let's start inside Russia, just east of the Kerch Bridge. Ukrainian drones struck the Afipsky oil refinery in Russia's Krasnodar Krai region last night. This is about 100 k's east of the bridge. Authorities there say drone debris started a fire, but there were no casualties and no significant infrastructure damage. This refinery accounts for just over 2% of Russia's oil refining output, so is a significant site. It was hit twice in August. Now, still in Russia, an explosion last night said to have damaged train tracks in Russia's Pskov Oblast, that's west of Moscow. It's up on the edge. It borders Estonia, Latvia and the northern bit of Belarus. Now, this comes from the regional governor there. Regional governor says there were no casualties. The train did not derail. Emergency services are working at the scene. Please remain calm, Mikhail Verdenikov said in his finest Frank Drebin voice. Now, on those oil refinery strikes, Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief General Alexander Syrsky, he said this morning the capabilities of the enemy's military-industrial complex have been significantly reduced. We can see this on the battlefield. He was speaking to a group of journalists in Kyiv, said the long-range campaign is starting to have a real effect and is directly hampering Russia's military operational activity. He said this is a fuel crisis in Russia which directly affects logistics and the supply of its army. Then, as we said yesterday, Russian pro-government media outlet Kommersant reported on Wednesday that around 50% of gas stations in occupied Crimea are said to have stopped selling gasoline due to these fuel supply disruptions. Disruptions not helped by the incident in Smolensk Oblast, that's west of Moscow up against Estonia, I think, where a fuel train was hit by a truck on a level crossing. There's very dramatic imagery you'll see on social media of an enormous fire with yet more Russian fuel unavailable for use. Now into Ukraine, and a Russian commander was said to have ordered his troops to open fire on subordinates attempting to retreat, according to alleged intercepted phone calls released by the HUR, Ukraine's military intelligence department, yesterday. So in this conversation reportedly captured in Donetsk Oblast, the commander demanded that troops stand their ground at all costs. The recording is said to say, "There is no way to retreat, no way. No one is retreating anywhere. Everyone is standing their ground. If anyone runs away, shoot them. I'll say it again, because if anyone runs away, just shoot them." Now, this reporting is from the Kyiv Independent. Neither they nor we can independently verify the authenticity of that audio. Ukraine last night repelled 128 of the 154 drones fired by Russia. However, that wasn't the only activity. Kherson in particular was hit by a number of glide bombs and artillery. There are injuries this morning. I think I've seen the reports of at least one person killed there, but attacks across the country, mercifully, very few casualties. Now, I'll point you to a thread on X, on Twitter. Independent military history author and researcher Chris O says that Russian air defence crews are being reassigned to the infantry as Russia appears to be running out of surface-to-air missiles, meaning they've got nothing to fire. So the Russian military correspondent Maxim Kalishnikov writes that he recently met Russian air defence specialists who had been sent to fight in the infantry, having spent 2 years crewing the Buk air defence system. Mr. Kalashnikov says professional air defence specialists in the infantry, not convicts, not drunks, not Sochi boys. Those are deserters from the army. He said someone has to serve in the infantry, but not real air defence professionals who know the equipment inside out. So why are they in the infantry? Simply because there just aren't enough missiles for the Buk missiles. Often there are just 1 or 2 for every 6 vehicles. Now, he doesn't explain why the missiles are in such short supply, but Chris O says the most likely explanation is that Ukraine's nightly waves of drone attacks against refinery and other targets have severely depleted the amount of air defence. Certainly that is what we've seen if you look at Crimea. We can't see any air defence around critical oil infrastructure across the country, but particularly across military, very specific military targets in Crimea. I think it's very interesting. You've got to keep our eye on Crimea. The uptick there has been very interesting. I'll come back to that a little bit later. A couple more from me. The National Guard of Ukraine has received American M2 Bradley IFVs, infantry fighting vehicles, for the first time, we're told. This comes from Ukrainian media channel TSN. They say the armoured vehicles have been transferred to the National Guard's Charter Brigade. Until now, they're only used by very sort of exclusive units of the ground and airborne forces. I spoke last night, I had a long conversation with one of my contacts serving in the Donbass, and he says it's vehicles that they're after. They're very, very low on vehicles. They just don't last. Either the tracks are blown off by drones or what have you, but the sort of life cycle of vehicles is very low. They need a high turnover just to do what they want to do, let alone try and form any kind of mechanised assault force. Now, Denmark's Aalborg airport was disrupted by suspected drone activity for the second time in 24 hours last night. It was shut down from 11 p.m. to midnight after an object was sighted in the sky. This comes after comments on Thursday by Defence Minister Troels Poulsen that a professional actor was behind the systemic operation of those drones on Wednesday night. So continuing that theme of the week. And just connected to that and linking back to the comments I was making earlier on about Crimea, Bloomberg published an article recently saying that British, French and German envoys met Russian officials in Moscow to privately say they'd be prepared to shoot down Russian jets if there are any more incursions. The officials reportedly concluded that the Russian commanders were deliberately ordering these jets through Estonian airspace and elsewhere. These incursions, the Russian official is said to have reported, were a response to Ukrainian strikes on occupied Crimea. Now, Bloomberg say the official claimed Ukraine was only capable of hitting Crimea because of NATO support. This official apparently said that Russia considers itself to be already engaged in a confrontation with NATO, including other European states. So 2 things sprang to mind for me. Firstly, if they're already in a confrontation, does that give European NATO states a bit of political room for manoeuvre and military room for manoeuvre? Clearly, Russia has not gone nuclear in this confrontation with NATO, so perhaps it means that there is a bit more political room, counterintuitively, I suppose, to shoot down a jet. And secondly, Crimea does seem to be, I think, in the last few weeks, seems to be a military priority for Ukraine. There have been numerous strikes there on air defence, other radars, aircraft, as we've been reporting. And we know Crimea is the heart of Putin's soul. Ukraine threatening it, landing on the peninsula, retaking any kind of territory there would be a huge blow to Russia and Putin personally. Very difficult to do, of course. An amphibious landing, getting across the water, or an airborne landing would be very, very difficult, but there does seem to be an increased focus just in the last few weeks against the military systems such as air defence and headquarters in occupied Crimea, and I wonder if this is the prelude to some large Ukrainian effort. But we will, of course, keep our eyes on it. And that's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. As you mentioned, gasoline shortages have begun in Moscow, with further reports today in the Russian press which failed to make any mention of Ukraine's campaign against the country's oil and gas infrastructure, but registers the frustration many citizens are feeling. Quote of the week has to go to this gas station employee. We haven't had any 92-octane gasoline for almost a day or even a week. No one knows why. It's just gone. Now, it comes off more bad financial news for the Kremlin as they've been compelled to announce plans to raise the rate of value-added tax from 20 to 22%, backtracking on Putin's pledge last year not to raise taxes again before 2030. I should just add, this is in addition to that tax that I was talking about the other day for wealthy Russians. The finance ministry justifies this by saying the funds would primarily be used to cover Russia's spiralling defence and security expenditure, as well as for support for veterans and social spending. It's stories like this which almost certainly contributed to Trump's about-turn in messaging this week. Our Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes has written in more detail for the paper just how Kyiv's strategy of targeting oil refineries seems to be paying off. It's got lots of maps of all the strike areas and graphs measuring the impact, and we'll link to that in the episode description. Another telling detail showing Moscow is worried comes from the fact they've increasingly banned the distribution of social media footage of Ukrainian attacks in some areas in an apparent attempt to stave off panic at home. Threaded together, it's these kinds of stories which can begin to sow discord in a society if people think their savings are in peril, for instance. But let's return to the UN General Assembly next, wrapping up the other relevant developments which have come off the back of it. Finnish President Alexander Stubb gave a rallying cry in his speech, a rallying cry for reform, really, saying that no single country should have a veto in the UN, and a Security Council member should lose its voting rights for a fixed period if it violates the UN Charter. Now, one of the things that jumped out at me attending the UN a couple of years ago was the sheer number of speeches calling for drastic reform. And there was even a recognition from the Biden administration that they believe there should be some changes. And yet the power that the veto gives the permanent members of the Security Council and the impossibility of removing it because of that same veto makes it highly unlikely there are going to be any changes anytime soon. NATO's Mark Rutte subsequently gave some punchy remarks to the press after Trump's intervention, saying he'd support the alliance shooting down Russian jets if they crossed into NATO airspace. I support Trump's call, Rutte said, urging people not to pay attention to Sergei Lavrov's claim that NATO and the EU have declared war on Russia through Ukraine. Rutte said, Lavrov has been Russia's foreign minister since the birth of Jesus Christ, and nothing useful has ever come from his mouth. Let's not focus too much on him. The supply of American weapons to Ukraine, financed by Washington's allies, will continue uninterrupted. Now, one of the other significant interventions of this week was by President Erdogan, who also said he supported NATO countries using the same approach as his countries in relation to foreign entities crossing their airspace. Since then, he met in the Oval Office with President Trump, and it's a pretty remarkable moment, really, from the US president when a journalist asked him about rigged elections. Rigged election, he said, pointing to Erdogan. He knows about rigged elections better than anybody. You honestly couldn't make this stuff up, really. Now, Trump also repeated his common refrain of late. I'm very disappointed in Putin. He fought hard, fought for a long time, and they lost millions, about 1 million soldiers. And you know, after all this heavy bombing over the last 2 weeks, they've gained almost no territory. Just think about it. They've gained almost no territory. I think it's time to stop. I really do. One last piece on the UN. Ukraine's First Lady, Olena Zelenska, did meet US First Lady Melania Trump as planned, posting afterwards, I am pleased to see that we share common values, care for the younger generation and the right of every child to a happy and fulfilling childhood. I'm sincerely grateful to Melania for her support of Ukraine and attention to those affected by the war unleashed by Russia. I believe together we can protect the most valuable thing, our future. Now, given Melania's interventions in conversations with her husband, that might prove a more significant meeting than meets the eye. Now, speaking of eyes, thanks to everyone who's written in response to our discussion about Five Eyes yesterday.
Oh, God.
Several of you wrote in to point out that the Cyclops is often depicted with 3 eyes. I'd forgotten that, I must confess. But yes, it was Heracles' children who were told by the oracle to find a guide with 3 eyes, finding a chap called Oxylus, who'd lost 1 eye and was riding a horse, making the pair together 3-eyed, fulfilling the prophecy. Get it?
Hang on.
He had 1 eye.
Oh, I thought you said he had 4 eyes.
No, I said he had 1 eye, didn't I?
Well, I don't know. So how
Yeah, he lost an eye, so he had one eye.
He's got one. Horse has got
2.
There's no eye in horse.
Oh, God. Right. Anyway, well done, everybody who got it right. I think I have to explain this to Dom off air. Couple of stories to end on. I'll save one about another secret Russian drone program in China for next week, as well as another story about the hacking of Russian authorities in occupied Crimea. They both require deeper dives, really. But President Zelensky said something interesting, that he won't seek a second term in office after Russia's full-scale invasion ends. Speaking to Axios, he said, "If we finish the war with the Russians, I'm ready to go, not for a second term. It's not my goal. Elections, I wanted very much in a very difficult period of time to be with my country, help my country. My goal is to finish the war." That tallies with indications he's given before, though, of course, there would still be some ways in which he could justify running if there was, say, only a ceasefire rather than a full end to the war. If it was still, say, safe enough to run elections, but the war was still technically not absolutely concluded. And it's with elections that I'll end today, as we approach, of course, the vital one in Moldova on Sunday. Vital not just for them, but for Europe. In the show notes, we'll link you to the episode of our sister podcast, Battle Lines, which provides the very latest on this story that we explored in detail on the podcast a few weeks ago. But I'll end with an investigation the BBC has done, which exposed a secret Russian-funded network attempting to disrupt those elections. Using an undercover reporter, they claim to have discovered a network that promised to pay participants if they posted pro-Russian propaganda and fake news undermining Moldova's pro-EU ruling party. Participants were paid to find supporters of Moldova's pro-Russian opposition to secretly record and to also carry out a secret poll. This was done in the name of a non-existent organisation, making it illegal. And the results of that selective sampling, then the theory being, would lay the foundation to question the outcome of an election if it went the other way. Now, this investigation just scratches the surface, frankly, of the kind of activities Russia is seemingly involved in Moldova. And it's, I think, unfortunate more European leaders aren't speaking about the country's election this week. As a reminder, Moldova is right on Europe's eastern flank. To its east is Ukraine, to its west, Romania, a member of NATO and the European Union. If Russia were to fundamentally erode Moldovan democracy, it's a country wedged right in the midst of a very significant geopolitical flashpoint. So we should all be watching what takes place there on Sunday very closely. But before I hand over to David Knowles, our Berlin correspondent James Rothwell has been looking into Europe's scramble to find ways to protect its skies from Russian drones. He's made a short video about it, which we've borrowed the audio from. We'll link to that and his story in the show notes.
One of the major European security stories has been all about the question of how we can defend ourselves from Russian drone attacks. And one of the ideas that's being discussed by the European Union is a drone wall. It sounds very impressive, but there's lots of questions about it. What is a drone wall? How would it actually work? How much would it cost? And most importantly, has it got a massive hole in it? We have seen so many incidents recently involving suspected Russian drone incursions, not just in Poland earlier this month, but also potentially at airports in Denmark and Norway. And that's created this huge dilemma for European Union countries, which is how we're going to deal with this. Now, first of all, a lot of people are asking the question, well, what is a drone wall? And the truth is that it's actually not quite clear at the moment. We do know that it's likely to involve radar, that it's likely to involve early detection tools, that it's likely to involve drone interception systems, basically a kind of mini missile, that is to say a missile that's much cheaper than a fighter jet missile, for example, which can be launched into the air, intercepts a drone, shoots the drone down and eliminates the threat. Whether it will actually look like that, we're not quite sure. It's at a very early stage, and we're also not quite clear on how much it's going to cost, although one EU security expert speculated to me that it might cost several billion euros. It sounds like a great idea. It's got a lot of backing from, I think, about 7 or potentially 8 EU member states, many of them who are based on that flank, who want to try and do something about the Russian incursions, the Russian threats. But the reporting that we've done this week has shown that there's a potentially major flaw in the EU's drone wall, and that is the fact that Hungary, a country which also, by the way, is increasingly pro-Kremlin, is not going to be part of the drone wall. And that means we're going to see potentially a sort of gap of about 90,000 square kilometres. It's a huge hole that Russian drone swarms potentially would be able to slip through. And as part of my reporting for this story, I spoke to Jessica Berlin, who's a very respected German security analyst. She immediately drew a comparison between the EU's drone wall as it's currently been envisaged and that famous Maginot Line.
It was a hidden battle line of fortresses, the Maginot Line.
Yes, it was very intimidating. Yes, it was very impressive. But when 1940 came, Nazi troops just bypassed it. They crossed into France via Belgium and the Ardennes forest, and they were able to, as we all know, fatefully invade France anyway. It didn't work because it had a fatal flaw. Jessica Berlin said there is a risk that if Hungary is not included in the EU drone wall, we might see a Maginot Line in the sky, and that's a big risk in terms of this policy for the European Union.
Thanks, James. This September, to mark a year since his untimely passing, we've published a series of short documentaries that the creator of this podcast, David Knowles, left unfinished at the time of his death. Thank you to everyone who's donated to one of the 2 fundraisers set up in his memory. Today will be the last we publish from David this year, and it focuses on another tragic event that took place in September, this time in 1941, and this time in Ukraine, during what became known as the Holocaust by bullets.
When David and I went to Ukraine in February 2024, we visited the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center.
It's a bright, cold day here in Kyiv, and we've come to one of the darkest places of European history, to Babyn Yar.
Babyn Yar is a long ravine and the site of the largest single massacre in the history of the Holocaust. 83 years ago, on the 29th and 30th of September 1941, over 30,000 Jews, Romani people and some political prisoners were shot dead by Nazi troops.
For the main part, they were herded down into the famous ravine that we're walking towards. Executed, shot in the back of the head, and then the other victims were forced to lay on top of them and they were shot.
Today, it's a city park where young mothers push their prams around a series of memorial installations.
We are here to try and understand how this massacre impacted Jewish history here in Ukraine and world history. We want to understand a little bit about how the memory of those victims has changed Ukrainian culture and history.
Hello. You're Alexei.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Adélie, nice to meet you. I've
David,
been
nice to meet you.
Okay.
I'm Alexei Makuhin. I'm CEO of Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center. Before the tragedy, it was a place of 5 cemeteries: Jewish cemetery, Orthodox, Muslim cemetery, military, which is still there on the opposite side. So we just passed the arc. And a building on your left, the only 2 buildings which were at that time. And according to Jewish religious laws, nothing could be ever built on cemeteries. These were built by Soviet Union, of course in violation of these Jewish religious laws. This is a national TV center of our national broadcaster, which is not in use now since the beginning of full-scale war.
So just to paint the picture for our listeners, we're coming down the long street towards the site, and we've got on the right, as you said, a huge Soviet building, the former TV center, and that was built, you say, by the Soviets because of the kind of the erasure of the memory, or?
Yes. The Soviet Union conducted a crime of oblivion, so they tried to erase any notion and memory about Jews killed here. There is a huge Soviet monument which stands quite far from here, and there is no mention of Jews at all. So it was erected in 1976, as far as I remember, and it is said that it is for the memory of Soviet people killed in World War II.
To understand what Alexei meant by crime of oblivion and how that played out in Soviet Ukraine, we spoke with William Blacker.
I'm an associate professor of Ukrainian and East European culture at UCL.
When we come to an event like Babyn Yar, how, in the years that immediately followed the Holocaust, how is that dealt with? How is that thought of in Ukraine?
So Ukraine obviously is under Soviet rule. The entire of Ukraine after the Second World War comes under Soviet rule, including the western part, which had been in Poland between the wars. The territories of Ukraine were part of the Holocaust geography. Looking at the territory of Ukraine, about 1/4 of the victims of the Holocaust, the Jewish victims of the Holocaust, came from the territories of today's Ukraine. These were events that were obviously alive in the memories of people who lived there, but on the official level, they were suppressed. Soviet memory policy towards the Holocaust was that there was no separate Jewish tragedy. There was a tragedy of the Soviet people. So the Nazis, the fascist invaders, came, murdered peaceful Soviet citizens, and that was the story. Telling any separate story, any kind of specific story that would be separate from that larger Soviet narrative was seen as ideologically suspect. The Jews of Ukraine were annihilated, but then the memory of their annihilation and their presence really before the war was sort of doubly annihilated by Soviet censorship.
So it's a grave of a rabbi, Rabbi Meir Leibush, and his son.
Back in Kyiv, we're walking up a long pathway to the top of the ravine. It's lined with gravestones and speakers.
As listeners may know, I did study Hebrew for 4 or 5 years at university, and there is a difference obviously in how you write Hebrew on a grave in the same way that it would be for English, right? Like they follow certain formulas, but we're seeing quite a few graves here, some with Ukrainian, some with Hebrew. There's a couple right in front of us at the moment in the shape of tree trunks with their branches cut off, and they've been arranged here on the side of the road as you walk towards the Babyn Yar site, and the names of the victims ringing out from the speakers that line the road to the centre.
Following the pathway, we finally make it up to the top.
We are standing approximately where the general hill was. You see it's a little bit higher. Before the tragedy and before the sand walls were exploded, in front of us would be a ravine almost 40 meters deep.
Now it's a almost flat park, really, but in front of us would have lain more than 30,000 bodies being covered by forced labourers. And then years later, when the Nazis were retreating from Kyiv, they dug all these bodies up again, and to cover their crimes, they burnt them. But we're standing pretty much where historians and experts think the massacre took place. So, Alexa, can you tell us where we are now? What are we looking at?
This is the object also made by our memorial center. It is called Glance into the Past. It is located at the place where this photo was made. So when you look at this monocular, you would see this famous photograph of German Nazi photographer, exactly how it was made.
When you look through this particular viewing point here, cut into the stone, you can see 2 German soldiers searching and sorting amongst a sea of belongings that the victims of Babyn Yar were asked to bring. Obviously, they were taken from them before they were killed. And what we're seeing now is a photograph from several days later, where the soldiers are going through what they've collected, presumably to sort them, take stuff, sell it on in the future. So this is, as Alexei said, this is just one of the memorial stones that they've got here, which is supposed to show us what, if we were standing here back in 1941, what we'd have seen if we were standing in exactly this spot. And now in modern Ukraine, in modern Kyiv, it's a completely different scene. If you did not know and you were walking past this, you'd assume it was just a neighbourhood park, really. The conflation of the cruelty and the evil that happened here in the Second World War and where we are now is quite something, and it's a very moving exhibit that they've got here to try and bring us back into the past to see what they would have seen.
That contrast between the mundane day-to-day activities of modern life and the horrors committed here embodied the difficult questions around memory in Ukraine. In 2021, a poll from the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology found that over 40% of Ukrainians did not know what had happened at Babyn Yar. What, whom, and how a country remembers is profoundly political.
Thinking about the Soviet policy of, as you've described it, of forgetting, of repression, does that change at all in all the time between 1945 and 1991? Were there some leaders or institutions that changed with the times, that challenged that? Or was it absolutely just a blanket? It was just like that for the entire time?
No, it does change. So, in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, and even during the war, you have, for example, writers from Ukraine, so Jewish writers and Ukrainian writers, in fact, who are writing non-fiction accounts of this, or poetry, poetic responses. And we have poetry written from the 1940s in Ukrainian, in Russian and in Yiddish about this. But then it becomes clear quite quickly that censorship comes down on this. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, we still have Stalin. There's an anti-Semitic campaign in the Soviet Union after the Second World War. A lot of the important Jewish intellectuals and writers are arrested and shot, actually, in the wake of the Second World War. Some of those who had been involved in documenting Nazi crimes in Kyiv and in Ukraine. So you have a sort of window during the war when it seems to be possible to speak about these things and to speak about, crimes against Jews, very quickly slammed shut. After the death of Stalin, we have de-Stalinization processes, we have the thaw. It does become possible to start very cautiously talking about these things. Some of the, let's say, not exactly dissident writers, but writers who are kind of stretching the limits of what's possible to say in the Soviet Union start to speak about this. One of the first is a Kyiv writer called Viktor Nekrasov, who was a Stalin Prize writer who'd written, fiction about his time serving during the Second World War. He, at the end of the 1950s, already started to write openly in the press that we need to, look, there are monuments at Auschwitz, for example, we need to do the same in Babyn Yar. So, fairly early on, we're talking the end of the 50s, there's a fairly famous poem written by the Russian poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko in 1961, about Babyn Yar, and the fact that it opens with the line, there is no monument at Babyn Yar. In the 1960s, we see a whole there's a whole sort of list of local intellectuals, activists, writers who start to speak about this.
One of those writers was Anatoly Kuznetsov. His book, Babyn Yar, a document in the form of a novel, offers a rare look into the occupation of Kyiv.
So that novel, Kuznetsov's novel Babyn Yar, is extremely important in just what we know about what happened there. I mean, there are very few accounts of what happened. I mean, there are very few survivors. The image we have of the Holocaust tends to be focused on Auschwitz. On the one hand, Auschwitz was not the only death camp, obviously, but a huge proportion of the Jews murdered in the Holocaust were not murdered in camps, were not gassed. They were shot and buried in mass graves. And Babyn Yar is one of very few substantial cultural texts that really puts that experience on the map of the Holocaust. It's a book with a very complicated history. It's a history that, connects Kyiv with London. It's a history that involves the telegraph. So Anatoly Kuznetsov was a writer from Kyiv who wrote in Russian. He came from a mixed Ukrainian-Russian family. He was in his early teens when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. So he witnessed the occupation of Kyiv. I think he was about 11, 12, 13, around about that age. He wrote down what he witnessed. So he kept notebooks where he just wrote down what he was seeing as a teenager. And some years later, apparently his mother found them and read them and said, you should do something with this. People often think that, Babyn Yar is going to be about the massacre of the Jews at Babyn Yar. The book is actually not just about that. It's a book about the city of Kyiv. It's a book about how the city becomes occupied. It's about what occupation is. It's about how people react to it. It's a book which is about Nazism and fascism, but also communism. It's a book where the author often compares the two systems. It's a much bigger thing than just a kind of testimony about that one specific, obviously horrific and extremely important episode. He also combined it with testimonies that he'd gathered from other people. So, for example, there's a very important testimony from an actress in one of the theatres in Kyiv who was a survivor of Babyn Yar, and he spoke to her, Dina Pronicheva, and basically incorporated her testimony into this text.
According to the book, Dina Pronicheva is the only eyewitness to have made it out of the massacre at Babyn Yar alive. She recounts how her group was lined up alongside the edge of the ravine. As she heard the sound of the machine gun come closer to her, she jumped ahead, falling, she says, on a sea of bodies covered in blood. The book continues. All around and beneath her, she could hear strange submerged sounds. Groaning, choking, and sobbing. Many of the people were not dead yet. The whole mass of dead bodies kept moving slightly as they settled down and were pressed tighter by the movements of the ones who were still living. The book is harrowing to read, but the story of its publication says as much about the politics of history in the USSR as the rare first-person testimony it contains. Anatoly Kuznetsov published the first edition of his manuscript in a Soviet literary journal.
But it was then heavily censored. There were a lot of things that Kuznetsov wrote there which were simply not acceptable, even at this moment, which is, supposedly a more liberal moment in Soviet history, where writers were, writing a bit more adventurously about the past, in the sort of context of de-Stalinization and so on. When he saw the censored manuscript, he in fact took the manuscript back and threw it away. He was so disgusted, but they had another copy and they published it without his permission, essentially. So he's very, very upset by that. Probably this was one of the main reasons that he decided to eventually defect to the West. It was very difficult to get out of the Soviet Union at that time. He managed to do it using a couple of different tactics. The first was to give in to pressure to denounce his fellow writers. So he wrote a denunciation of writers like Yevtushenko and others. He also invented a project for a new novel about Lenin. He said, I'm going to write a book about the creation of the Communist Party, about Lenin's time in London. He said, I need to go to London to do research to see where Lenin was, and so on. So he took photographs of the original manuscript, the uncensored manuscript. He sewed the negatives into his jacket, and he came to the West, came to London, and he managed to slip away from his Soviet minder, who was with him pretty much constantly, on the pretext of going to see a strip show in Soho. So this is how he managed to get away. The person he made contact with was a journalist at the Telegraph called David Floyd, who himself is a very interesting character, who, I guess unbeknownst to Kuznetsov, had been a Soviet spy, but sort of by this time had come around to a more kind of critical position towards the Soviet Union, was working as a journalist for the Telegraph, and he spoke very good Russian. Kuznetsov didn't speak English. Contacted David Floyd and asked him to help him contact the British authorities, get permission to stay, to basically to be allowed to defect. And that's what he did, and he lived the rest of his life in London. Published the novel Babyn Yar shortly afterwards. I think the full version came out in 1970, and that's basically how the world found out the details of the so-called Holocaust by bullets, and specifically what happened in Kyiv.
Back in Kyiv, we're standing in the middle of one of the installations called the Mirror Field. It's an enormous mirrored disc with 10 stainless steel columns rising 6 meters into the air. The installation was created by firing 30,000 bullets into it, the same caliber ammunition that the Nazis used during the execution in Babyn Yar.
So this low-frequency sound, which you might hear, is played by this inside construction. It consists from names of victims translated into Hebrew, and then according to gematria which is part of Kabbalah, where each letter has a number. So these names have translated into numbers, and each number has a music tone. And we hear these music tones on low frequency.
We're walking through Babyn Yar, and you might be able to hear in the distance the air raid alarm has just sounded. At the start of the full-scale invasion, the TV tower, which looms to our right, was hit by a missile, and another missile landed on the Babyn Yar site. That meant that death once again came to Babyn Yar. So what we're going to do now, we're hearing the alarm, is check some of the telegram channels to find out what's heading towards us, and then decide what to do based on that. So is it drones, is it missiles? There's a metro station very close. Alexei and Vitaly, our guides here in Babyn Yar, seem to be quite unconcerned and are inviting us to get back into the golf cart to go to the next exhibit. Looking around, most people are carrying on their way in the park. But this is the first time I think we've been out and about in this reporting trip that the sirens have started, and since we're in the centre of a park, they're sounding quite loudly here. We can hear several from different directions.
We continue on the tour, following Alexei to the Crystal Wall of Crying, created by artist Marina Abramovich.
So in front of us is this vast wall that corresponds to the wall of the temple in Jerusalem, and in this wall, protruding from the wall, are three crystals. What are they trying to do? What's the art installation trying to affect here?
Yeah, the idea is that a person comes and stands in front of crystals, and with crystals targeted at your three basic centers, a person could reflect or meditate.
It's quite sharp, so it's really almost feels like where bullets could have transpierced my skull, and then the one on my chest doesn't quite reach it, so I can't feel it, but there's another one coming into my stomach. So the pointedness of them kind of piercing through your body is pretty evocative in a weird way. Makes you feel very vulnerable.
Well, it's certainly a way to make sure you're still for a certain amount of time. And I think that maybe gives you the space to open your mind slightly to everything in front of you. So right in front of my eyes I can see this Donbass sort of crystallised coal. I think part of my mind though is still wondering when the next air raid siren's going to come, and how we have to check the telegram app to work out if it's missiles or warplanes or anything else that will be firing towards where we are right now.
If David and I were pretty moved by the installation, it's a good example of what many have criticised about the memorial. Although it was intended as a symbolic continuation of the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, the crystals used by Marina Abramovich are Brazilian and have no link to the site or its history whatsoever. They can be illuminated at night, just like many of the other installations, and one could argue that yes, they make the memorial visible, but it also makes for a pretty picture. It's not just the installations that have been criticised, but also the people behind the project.
Something that became pretty evident when we were there is the extensive involvement and cash support from what we would in the West describe as oligarchs, extremely rich businessmen. Could you talk a little bit about that? What is their involvement? Why are they, how should we read that as foreigners not from there?
Yeah, this is a good question, and a complicated question. There have been several projects over the last 30 years to build some kind of new monument at Babyn Yar. Some kind of memorial centre, museum. Things don't get off the ground. There are arguments between different interest groups. There are arguments, within the Ukrainian Jewish community over how to do this. There was an initiative, the Babyn Yar Memorial Centre, I forget which year, but I think it's like maybe 2016, something like that, funded with oligarch money. Oligarch called Mikhail Friedman, who was one of the main drivers behind this, who was born in Lviv, but basically considered a Russian oligarch, made his money, lived in Russia, associated with the Russian authorities. It became controversial, first of all, for, I suppose, reasons of, let's say, aesthetics. Friedman at some point suddenly invited a Russian film director called Ilya Khranovsky to be the sort of creative director of the project. And some of the ideas that he brought, and which were then leaked to the press, caused some controversy. So it was basically, it was described by one of the historians who then resigned, a German historian who then resigned from the project, as turning it into Holocaust Disneyland. But the other problem, of course, is that these are figures who are connected to Russia. Not only is Ukraine at war with Russia, but when Russia is justifying its violence against Ukraine, it's using the Second World War. It's using the history of the Holocaust. It's using the history of, quote-unquote, Ukrainian fascism. We all know that Putin invaded to denazify Ukraine. So you can see why having wealthy Russian individuals with very strong links to the Russian state in charge of the central main Holocaust site in Ukraine might seem a little bit risky and problematic to people. There are also questions over the links between Friedman and Vladislav Surkov, who's a sort of spin doctor, a Russian spin doctor who'd worked specifically on Ukraine. Does that mean that there was a Russian state plot to use the site of Babyn Yar and the new memorial centre to kind of undermine Ukrainian statehood in some way? We don't know. There could have been, there might not have been. On the other hand, if you look at what was actually happening there, they actually did a lot of good work. So it's difficult to give a kind of clear assessment of this whole initiative.
You spoke about how in the 90s, the memory of what happened is starting to slip away as people die, as people move away, emigrate, etc. Could you talk a little bit about what that process was like for the newly independent country of Ukraine that, I guess, finally had the freedom to reconcile and to deal with its past as it saw fit?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting moment. In 1991 comes, you can say anything you want, you can publish anything you want. But that doesn't mean that everything is kind of plain sailing and simple. For a start, Ukraine is economically in a very, very bad state. When there isn't money to build roads, there's not going to be money to build monuments. Secondly, you have a country which has many, many, many fewer Jews than it had before the Second World War. There is a Jewish community. There are people of Jewish background, but the Jewish communities are quite small. So in terms of public interest in these topics, you're talking about something that relatively small interest groups are really, really sort of invested in. Many Ukrainians look at this as a moment where now we start to tell our own history, and our Ukrainian history has also been silenced and repressed. There's also, however, a kind of tension between the recovery of a Ukrainian national memory and remembering the Holocaust and the Second World War. Because there are certain aspects of that national story which involve questions of collaboration. When you have there's a Ukrainian nationalist resistance movement in the Second World War which is fighting first and foremost against the Soviets. So as in many places in Europe, the Nazis coming in, the Germans coming in, is seen as, perhaps this is going to improve things for us now. How do you square glorifying anti-Soviet resistance with commemorating the Holocaust when some members of some parts of that resistance might have been involved with collaboration, Nazi collaboration, might have been involved in the Holocaust? And that was the case. It was the case of Babyn Yar. What we've seen, especially the last decade or so, Holocaust commemoration in Ukraine has developed a lot. There's a lot more attention to these topics in the media, in various kind of commemorative projects in places like Kyiv, but also in Lviv. But that question of, collaboration, that's the thing that's not really worked through, that's not really spoken about yet.
As we reach the end of our tour at Babyn Yar, David and I found ourselves standing in front of a tall wooden structure, like a standing rectangle of wood.
This is a symbolic synagogue, and this is synagogue in shape of a book, because Jewish people are people of a book, Torah, and it opens, and like a child book which opens and something pops up from it.
As if by magic, the rectangle begins to unfold in front of our eyes.
So inside the synagogue, everything is folded up, and as it opens, the building becomes clear. I've never seen anything like this. It's an entire building opening up in front of us. Adélie, have you seen anything like this before?
No, it's absolutely gorgeous. It's incredible to watch.
As the shofar sounds, as the synagogue is unfolded before us, half of the wall is now coming down.
And of course, David couldn't help but break into Hebrew.
And on the top right, we've got the Shema, so Shema Israel, Eloheinu Echad, Barach Shem Kavod, Olam Ve'etz V'Achava. That's beautiful. Also, I must confess at this point, I did 4 or 5 years of academic Hebrew, and I wish I'd done slightly more revision before coming here. Can I ask, when the entire synagogue unfolded before us, I don't think we've seen anything as beautiful in our time in Ukraine. But for you, when you're looking at all of this, as one of the directors of this site, what's the most beautiful part of this for you?
I like in general how beautiful and vivid are the images, and we had a discussion frankly with the architect and his team whether it should be such vivid or should not, and I'm happy that we decided to do it, because at the very beginning there was no paintings on this wall. We had only this ceiling. It refers to tradition of wooden synagogues in western Ukraine. They were also so colorful and joyful. Of course, this whole place is rather tragical and dark, but one of the basic ideas of Judaism is to celebrate life, and I think that this synagogue helps to celebrate life. Do you want to go upstairs?
Oh yeah.
So we're standing in a small platform looking down within the synagogue, but looking down onto the floor. Where are we?
It's a balcony of the second floor. In synagogue you should have separate zones for men and women. This is second floor for women.
We're closer now to the ceiling, which, as you said, let's just try and describe it. So there's a deep blue in the background and many flowers.
Yes, each flower is a star. Yeah. So it's a sky constellation. Each flower is a star, each animal, there are 6 animals here, is a zodiac sign.
It's very, very beautiful, and it's the middle of winter here. We're here in a wartime, in like a very tragic place, and just seeing something so colourful and so full of life, and kind of reminding you as well of that is the sort of places Ukrainian Jewish people would have gone to, and that would have been part of their daily lives before the Holocaust. Is quite moving.
I think as well there's a sort of confluence of history. So in the background, we're on the balcony in this synagogue, and in the background we can see the giant TV tower which was struck by Russian missile at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. So it's a reminder that the war isn't very far away, and I guess for the people in the 1940s it wasn't, and for the people here it's not either.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.